Selected by the studio art faculty, the exhibition this year features art by 22 students. They include studio art majors and minors, along with non-majors that were in studio classes throughout the past academic year. The exhibition includes some wonderful digital photographs, prints, video, and sculpture. In the booth lobby, just outside the museum, we are presenting the print series Jazz, created in 1979 by Romare Bearden, one of the leading American artists of the 20th century, known for his depiction of African American life in his paintings, prints, and especially his collages. Bearden's Jazz series is absolutely stunning, so please take some time to look at that in the booth lobby. Excuse me. We have two exhibitions devoted to the Catalan-American artist Pierre Daura. The exhibition, Picturing Attachments, in the Harnett Museum, focuses on the many ways Daura's attachment to his wife Louise and daughter Martha found expression in his art throughout his lifetime. The images, including many self-portraits, represent important events in his life and give a visual autobiography of the artist. Concurrent with Picturing Attachments, we have on view the artist's line, Drawings by Pierre Daura, from the collection in the Harnett Print Study Center. Sequoia Roscoe, a senior political science major, was our 2015 Harnett Summer Research Fellow, and researching the drawings from our collection for the exhibition was her summer project. Before I introduce tonight's speaker for our exhibition, Picturing Attachments, I would like to acknowledge several people in the audience. First of all, we are thrilled to have with us this evening our new president of the university, Dr. Ronald Crutcher, and his wife, Dr. Betty Crutcher. They're here on the third row. If you could. It's wonderful. I am also delighted and honored that Martha Daura is with us tonight. And Martha, you want to? Martha is the daughter of Pierre Daura, and you will see many wonderful images and drawings and paintings of her in the exhibition. She is responsible for donating 228 works by her father to the university museums, including drawings, prints, watercolors, and paintings. We are so very fortunate to be the recipient of such beautiful and important works by Pierre Daura. And Martha, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your generosity to the University of Richmond. It's really... Pierre Daura, 1896 to 1976, Picturing Attachments, was organized by the Indiana University Art Museum in Bloomington and was curated by Heidi Gelt, Director Emerita of the museum. The exhibition was made possible through the generous support of the Daura Foundation, the Indiana University Art Museum's ARC Fund, and the Moravec Fund, and the Georgia Museum of Art and the Daura Archive. The exhibition and the accompanying catalog are dedicated to Thomas W. Mapp and Andrew Lattice, and I would like to mention that today would have been Tom Mapp's birthday. I just found this out, so it's wonderful timing for our event tonight. At the University of Richmond Museums, the exhibition and related programs are made possible in part with support from the Daura Foundation and funds from the Lewis S. Booth Arts Fund. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Heidi Gelt. Dr. Gelt has been director of the Indiana University Art Museum since 1986, and she just recently became Director Emerita. Who knows what she'll do with her extra time now? She continues on the faculty as a professor of art history in the Department of Art History at Indiana. She has published extensively, particularly in the area of 18th century Venetian drawing. Her books include two books, both co-authored with George Knox, on Domenico Tiepolo. One is on his drawings of contemporary life in Venice. The second one is described as a massive book on Tiepolo's New Testament drawings. In this case, massive means it's 866 pages. So I don't even know how thick that is. And of course, she is the curator and author of the accompanying book to our exhibition, Pierre Daura, Picturing Attachments. I noticed in her CV that one of her ongoing projects, and this fits in obviously with the exhibition, is research on creative attachments, a survey of how Western artists responded to their personal relationships, from Daura to Lucian Freud. Following her lecture, we will take a few questions, and then please join us for the reception and to see our new exhibitions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gelb. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Richard. You're the first person I want to thank. I feel like in these last few days, I finally got to meet Richard. We've been in communication for more than 2 years over this project, and I feel like I've made a friend for life. It's just been wonderful. And I also want to, of course, thank all the staff at the University of Richmond Museums for all their help. And I'm terrifically honored to have met the President and First Lady Crutcher. And it turns out we have a few Indiana University connections, which is wonderful. I'm totally indebted to Martha Daura and Tom Mapp, and I'm so glad Martha's here today. This show was actually a partnership also with Bill Eiland and Barbara Rothermel, and Barbara's here tonight, and I want to thank her again for collaborating on this project. It's been a project of a lifetime, and only because for the 10 years before I got diverted back to Domenico Tiepolo, I'd been studying artist relationships, and then once the New Testament project was over, I went back to that. With that framework, the gift that Martha gave to our museum, an extraordinary gift of works by Pierre Daura, suddenly started resonating with me in a whole new way. So this project has really been a special one for me. And I would say, especially because of the times I was able to spend with Martha and Tom and the trip we all took retracing Pierre's steps, it's the project of a lifetime. And I hope as you all see this exhibition and see the biographical underpinnings of the works in the show, that you get just half the pleasure out of it that I've had. So these are the venues. It's opened at the IU Art Museum. Each installation has been different and wonderful in its own way. And I love the installation that you have here. Richard, I don't know another museum director who has quite the portfolio that you do, but you manage it all so brilliantly. Your institution is lucky to have you. So really, this exhibition is about 3 people. It's about Pierre Daura, the artist, his wife, Louise Heron Blair, and their daughter, Martha. It covers lots of events in his life, from his courtship to his marriage, Martha's birth, his service in the Spanish Civil War, his exile to America during World War II, Louise's later illness and death. All these events found expression in Daura's work in interesting and surprising ways. And I think they're among the most beautiful works and most moving works that Pierre created. So I wanted to give you a quick summary of Pierre's life. So he's born on the island of Minorca, 1896. He has a very happy childhood, actually, is very close to his mother. And then when she died very suddenly, Pierre wasn't even 8 years old yet, in 1904 when she passed away. This was a huge shock to him, and he never really forgot it. And I've noticed also in my bigger study, there are some artists for whom this kind of frames how the artist approaches the rest of his career. And Pierre actually was more conscious about stating it. And much later in his life, he said, "It's always the mother. It is always the mother and child. No one has been able to explain the gift that she gives. No intellectual has been able to explain. Everything turns to the mother and child." So for him, this really became his subject ultimately. In 1908, he studied with Picasso's dad. By 1913, he had graduated from his art school and was encouraged to go to Paris, where he met Émile Bernard. Then World War I, he gets there to Paris just before World War I breaks out. And Spain was neutral during that war, but in 1917, Pierre does his own military service, and then 1920 to 27, he's back in Paris. And in late 1927, he meets an American visitor, a 22-year-old Louise Heron Blair. And I think it was almost love at first sight. And during his courtship of her, one of the things that I know he gave Louise as a kind of stand-in for himself and a kind of special gift of self. I mean, imagine if you're courting and you start falling in love, most people would give each other a snapshot or something, but an artist can do something much better than that. So he gives Louise a portrait of himself, a likeness of himself, made by himself. We don't know exactly which self-portrait that was, but the one on the screen, which is at Lynchburg now, comes close in size and scale to the one we know he gave her. And the reason I was able to guess what it might look like is because we have a letter which is now in the Daura archive. One of the pleasures of this research was, at the time I started working, the archive was still in Martha and Tom's house, so I got to spend lots of time with Martha and Tom going through the archive. And this letter it's so adorable, because what she's saying in the many letters that she exchanges with Pierre at the time, that she's kissing his self-portrait, which she has tucked in bed next to her. And she says later in the letter, "As I know you're kissing the portrait of me in the black dress." Well, the portrait of her in the black dress, we'll get to that in a minute, is now at the IU Art Museum. But to give you background, courtship was a time that many artists made images of their beloved. One of the earliest known in history is Dürer's portrait of Agnes. It was a very different kind of courtship. That wasn't a courtship, actually. He had gone on his journeyman's tour, and while he was away, his father arranged his marriage. So this may be the first time he actually clapped eyes on her, knowing that she would be his wife. But interestingly, Albrecht Dürer also did a sort of visual chronology of Agnes over their years together. So this is the portrait, much more formal, that Pierre made of Louise. And this happens to be one of the ones when Martha said, "Would you like to come and pick some pictures?" I fell in love with this one right away. Martha never told me it was her mother. I just thought it was a gorgeous painting. And there's a kind of, what do I want to say, contained passion here. I mean, the colors are golden and molten. She's formal, but he's already capturing, those succulent lips. I mean, there's sensuality in this, but it's very formal. And what I don't have evidence of is Pierre making many images until they actually became formally engaged. Not everything is dated, but I think he wanted to be sure of Louise before he committed himself artistically. They then married, and I want to give you a sense of what artists do when they marry. This is an actually fascinating example. You can have artists make portraits of their wives. Sometimes they do self-portraits and their wife. In this case, two artists married, and they did a single portrait. It's a double portrait in a single frame. And Marie Trübke painted her husband, and her husband painted her. So they each painted the other. They later got divorced, but Pierre works on paper, and he created a pair of etched portraits, and he uses the kind of paired portraiture which we know existed from the 15th century on. Jan van Eyck, for example, we are pretty certain he did a paired set of portraits of his wife and himself. What I love about this is also the first time that we have documented an inscription that attaches the emotion he feels to Louise in the self-portrait he's now giving her. It dedicates it to her and says, "To my love, Louise." So then we have early marriage, so kind of early marriage and the honeymoon period. Pierre does something which I just found fascinating, and that is that he loved costume, and he actually designed batik textiles and knew how to do that and made some for Louise, but he also dressed her up in Spanish costume. And here's this American, and he gets her dressed up in his native costume. And in this case, it's a costume he collected from Asturias, which is this northern part of Spain. And I classify this, being an art historian, you always want to classify stuff, but this is very easy to classify in the sense that it belongs to a long tradition of artists portraying their wives in what we call fancy dress. And here's an earlier example of that. Rembrandt, after he marries Saskia, portrays her as Flora. And so he loads her head up with all kinds of flowers. She's holding a shepherd's stick also laden with flowers, and he's got this fancy gown dressed around her. So the inference, the goddess of spring, love, you can just imagine. By the time that Pierre is doing this tradition was past. But I think Pierre actually was a very sensitive art historian and knew a lot about the history of art. And whether he consciously appropriated a past tradition, which is what I think he did, or whether it was a combination of he loved interesting ways to portray Louise, he came up with fancy dress portraits. By 1930, Louise was expecting a child. And so this actually becomes a very interesting phenomenon in the history of art, because I discovered there were two, I want to say taboos for lack of a better term. Not very many artists ever painted their wives obviously pregnant. And Pierre, we know from Martha telling me about this, that this was a painting painted of Louise just before she finally gave birth to Martha. What we see is someone deep in contemplation. Her hair is down, she's wearing a robe. She looks very serious, thinking about what's about to happen. But you can't tell, because it's cropped at the bosom, you can't really tell unless you know the date and what the circumstances are. You can't tell that this is a painting about pregnancy. And in fact, in that sense, Pierre was following what I would call the more conservative tradition. One of the artists to break that mold, and there were a few, but it still remains a less commonly used subject among artists, was Michael Ancher, a Swedish painter, who, when he painted and then exhibited this portrait of his wife Anna, who herself was a painter, in 1884, it created just about as much furor in the Royal Academy in Sweden as Manet's Olympia did when Manet portrayed his Olympia. So it created a shock. And I mean, this is such a conservative painting, but you can tell she's pregnant. So this was actually one of those taboos. But certainly what you do see is a number of artists, whether they actually show that their wives are pregnant, they use the moment or the idea that their wives are pregnant, the knowledge that they are. A number of artists, from Ang, I have many examples, who portray their wives. They're celebrating the fact that a child is coming. So Martha was born on the 24th of September. It was a difficult delivery, and Pierre, in the end, had to assist. But once all that was over, everyone was just rapturous about the birth of this child. And I don't think Pierre needed any other inspiration than the fact that he now had this baby daughter to look at and rejoice with, because now his idea of family life was completely fulfilled. He filled notebooks full of drawings of Martha alone, Martha with her mom, and this sketchbook, which is now at the Georgia Museum of Art, is one example. I love this because Louise is testing the temperature of gruel, I think, with her, holding it to her thumb while baby Martha may be nursing there. And here's an etching that he made, multiple scenes of Louise and Martha, and it was dedicated to Dear, who was Pierre's mother-in-law in Virginia. Now we know that when they met, they had been living in Paris, but once Pierre and Louise married, they both decided they'd like to relocate, and Pierre had always had his heart set on this incredible village. It's now a World Heritage Site called Saint-Cirque-la-Popie, which is several hours outside of Paris, and it's exact opposite. I mean, this tiny little medieval village on a mountainside, as tiny as Paris is huge, as ancient as Paris is modern, and they renovated a medieval house, and that's where they lived and where Martha grew up. And here, Pierre did something which is very interesting. He belongs to a smaller group of artists who, for whom family and home become intertwined in such a way that artistic imagery is embedded into the house that reflects the connection to the family. So one of the things that Pierre painted in the hallway near the kitchen is a scene of Martha and Louise and Martha, very much in a sacred context. That you could interpret them as Saint Anne and the Virgin Mary, but their names are written on the wall. And really, by having it so close to the kitchen, Pierre is reinforcing the notion of the hearth and the home and the family and food all being part of the core of the house and the core of family life. And there are a number of artists throughout history that have done this. One of the earliest painters I found who really made his home and his house one and the same as family in a way was Federico Zucchero. And if you ever go to Rome, go to the Palazzo Zucchero. In 1590, he filled his little palazzo with murals of himself, his wife, his children, his parents, his uncles. In the 1880s, Marie Denis painted a number of rooms and painted his wife's whole bedroom with murals celebrating their marriage and the birth of a child. Carl Larsson, who you see here, was also totally inspired, the Swedish painter, by his wife, Karin, and he painted her portrait so that her face is always looking into him as he's working in his studio. So this is her face looking at him through the studio door. So between 1934 and 35, the Dauras came to America to visit Louise's family and get to know them. And Pierre, of course, took along painting equipment and drawing equipment. He didn't bring his etching materials. And what I love about Pierre is that here he is now in a strange country, kind of a visitor and a guest, but he's with his family, and so he paints Martha, and because she's in America, he wants to paint her in a way that reflects his understanding of American traditions. So he inscribes it, Martha Daura, painted by her dad, which I just love. He did a number of wonderful drawings in this period. And this is one of my favorites. I hope you all see it in the show. And I haven't seen anything quite like this. I've seen a number of images of artists, daughters or children being attended to by their mothers, either being taught to read or taught to draw. But this is the only one I know of where Louise is pointing out the intricacies of a typewriter to Martha. It's a wonderful drawing. Another subject that became very of interest to me because I'd seen it consistently crop up among artists was the loved one asleep. And I can vouch for this. I'm married to a painter, and the first half of his career he did figurative work, and he's now a landscape painter, thank goodness, because posing is a bore. And the easiest way to pose is to fall asleep. But the flip side of that also is the intimacy that an image made by an artist of someone who's asleep means you have access to someone in their most vulnerable, most intimate, most unself-conscious moment. Some of the earliest examples known to me, and they're also wonderful, are done by Rembrandt of his first wife, Saskia. For some reason, when Saskia died, he then had a common-law wife, Hendrika Stoffels, and I can't find him doing any drawings of Hendrika asleep. But anyway, Saskia had many reasons to draw. She was asleep, sometimes she was ill, and then in the end she was dying. But this is a wonderful example. There are a number of other artists, including Courbet and Rousseau. So it's a terrific subject and very consistent among artists. And Pierre is no exception. Here's Martha asleep during one of their trips to Lynchburg. It must have been a hot summer day, and she's taking a nap. And it's just a masterful drawing. Has everything down, the weight of her body, the angle of her pose, the way her legs are connecting, with just a few lines. It's a brilliant, brilliant drawing. And it's also just so wonderful because it's a topic that aligns him with this long tradition. So in 1937, the Spanish Civil War broke out. Pierre is now in his 40s, and much earlier, in his 20s, he'd fallen off a scaffold and had injured his left arm. But despite the fact that he only had one functioning arm, he was so distraught about what was happening, he decided to enlist with the Loyalists. And Louise, there are heartbreaking letters in which he describes that she knows she can't hold him back. So, and this is a rare instance. I haven't found a parallel for this. So he leaves in February, but in January, Louise's birthday, what does he do? He makes a special present for her, and it's another self-portrait. And my feeling is they were both aware, but especially Pierre was aware, that he might not come back from the war, and this self-portrait might have to stand in for him for the rest of her life. You can only see part of the inscription, but you can see the date, and it says for her birthday. This is a subject that needs more research, and I've actually spent a lot of time collecting data on artists who went off to war to see if any other artist had done something like this, in anticipation of what might come, leaving behind something very special for his family. And so far I haven't found that. What I have found is that there are images that artists sometimes do to celebrate a return. We have examples, for example, by Holbein, but nothing quite like this. And of course, Pierre served as the sighter for gunners. He wasn't firing a gun himself. But there were a number of instances where he had to make sure that his gunners were not going to fire on innocents, and he witnessed or heard about atrocities. And in one particular case, they almost forced him to give him the coordinates for a building that they thought were full of the enemy, but which he saw were children. And one child in particular reminded him of his daughter. When he came back, wounded in 3 places, one of the first things he did was a series of etchings called Civilization, but in meaning ironic. And Louise and Martha were the models for the victims of rape and other war atrocities. And in this instance, Martha is the stand-in for the innocent victims. And you can see a drawing that was done probably during the summer at Lynchburg gets reused for this image of a sick or dying child with her grieving family all around her. I should also point out, and it's not in the show, but it's in the book, that one of Pierre's first gifts to Louise on returning was also a drawing of Martha, the most special, something they had, this child they produced together, something they both deeply loved. So his gift, again, to Louise on return was this drawing of Martha. During this time, Pierre consistently identified himself with the Loyalists and wearing hats with the Loyalist badge, an army uniform, any number of works. The IU Art Museum has a print, a watercolor. The Georgia Museum of Art, which you have here, splendid self-portrait of Pierre. I mean, he was haunted by this experience. He was distraught by what was happening. Louise and Pierre did everything they could to help people who were dislocated from the war. So it was a very, very difficult time. So in 1939, Louise actually was ill with a kidney problem, and they thought she needed emergency surgery, so they left for the United States. And while they were there, it turns out she wasn't as sick as anyone thought. But World War II broke out, and so they stayed in Virginia for the duration. And what I find interesting is in this period, and the painting doesn't have an exact date, but it looks to me like it's in the earlier part of after his arrival. He paints Louise in colonial costumes. So now she's in America, so you go back to the American roots, and he gives her an American accent in his dress-up pictures. And Martha, of course, became a continuous subject, and you'll see in the show, I'm only giving you a brief survey of everything that this show is about. One of the highlights is this marvelous, 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 a masterpiece. It can hold up to anything in any museum. A portrait of Martha at 13, which is now at the Georgia Museum of Art. The painting actually was one of the works of Pierre's that hung in their house. So while he didn't mural the house in the Rockbridge Baths the way he did in Saint Cyr, certainly family pictures were part of the decor, and this was one of them. It's just a splendid painting. And then at 15, Martha graduated from E.C. Glass High School in Lynchburg. And Pierre eventually painted her portrait in her graduation dress. And this is one that I fell in love with and asked Martha if I could have, again, not knowing that it was actually a portrait of her. I mean, we were going through so much stuff, and it was kind of a blur. The pictures remained riveting to my mind. So again, it was marking a special occasion, and it's formally posed. It actually reminds me very much of Louise's engagement portrait. During this interlude in the United States, Pierre also Americanized a traditional subject that dates back to the 17th century. He calls it musique domestique, and it shows Martha and Louise singing. Louise is playing a pump organ they bought for about $5, and between the two of them is this abundant still life, including a jar of canned peaches or canned apples, probably canned peaches, and this gourd that's open, very much like these lush still lifes from the 17th century. And in fact, the iconography of this, especially the part about making music, artist family members making music, aligns itself with a long tradition that came out in Holland in the 17th century, which aligns the making of music with family harmony. And I'm just going to show you one example here, but I found many. David Teniers, his wife Anna Bruegel, and their son, the young David Teniers III. Teniers himself was a famous player of the viola da gamba, so he's present in the picture by virtue of the instrument that everyone knew he played. His wife is playing an instrument, his son is blowing bubbles, but it's all about, again, collating the notion of making music and the harmonious relationship within a family. So in this case, too, Pierre modernized the subject, brought it into the 20th century. And I think he's one of the few artists, I haven't found any other 20th century artist to take a traditional subject like that and bring it forward and make it his own. And this is probably the most sensuous painting of Louise that he ever painted. So there's also this notion of fecundity and fertility and sensuality. And there were artists, they didn't paint their wives nude, but they certainly placed an emphasis on their wives' sensuality. So in the 1950s, by then the war was over, he was able to go back to Saint-Cirque for the summers. He was teaching in the United States. And I think he started really thinking, especially in wake of World War II, what were his real values? What were the real values in life, especially after what the world had just gone through? And to him, he went right back to his core value, which is mother and child and the family, in its broadest and its narrowest context. So among the things he did was consider the sacred dimensions of family life. And he went back to the Holy Family that connected to him, which is Saint Anne and the young Virgin Mary. And so this, to me, is Louise and Martha becoming Saint Anne and the young Virgin Mary, as they had been in the murals in Saint-Cirque-la-Popie. He also created broader, more expanded family images. In this case, he adds a grandmother, and I think he's alluding to his own mother, who he had lost so long ago. And she's the linchpin around this whole group, the father, and mother, and the grandchildren. There's a sense that they're mourning, they're grieving, but they're also in great solidarity. The language is both simplistic, very elemental, but it's all about the interdependence of the generations and the importance of family to human life. As is the case, I think, for all of us as we face our later years, they're years of wonderful things and also years of challenge and loss. In Pierre's case, Louise fell ill. She lost one of her eyes to cancer in 1968 and then ultimately died of cancer in 1972. And this, I think, is one of the last portraits, certainly the last portrait I could find of Louise. And of course, to me, it's especially poignant because the most vivid aspect of this beautiful likeness of a beautiful older woman is the luminosity of her eyes. So this was painted about 9 years before her illness had struck. This is the last known portrait that I am aware of that Pierre painted of Martha here at age 32 with a unicorn in the background. I, of course, being an art historian, thought, oh, she's the only child, she's a unicorn. No, she happened to love the unicorn tapestries at the Cluny Museum, and that's why Pierre put them in. So knock one down for the art historian, wrong. But it's a wonderful painting, again, of Martha, and it's the last one that I know of. But that's 32 years of chronicling a daughter and decades of chronicling his life with Louise. When artists confront illness within the family, they do often, and death, they have different ways of reacting. And we can trace examples of this, again, back to the 17th century. This is Rembrandt drawing Saskia. She's no longer just pregnant and resting. You can tell by the expression on her face. She's either just lost another child, but she's certainly in decline. So artists can chronicle illness, and in fact, into the 20th century, Ferdinand Hodler probably stands out among artists. I think he did 222 paintings of Valentine Godel, who was his mistress at the time, and she died from cancer. So you can, there were artists who take that route. There are other artists who design monuments, or they do posthumous portraits, or in the case of Frank Duveneck, who lost his wife after, I think, less than 2 years of marriage, designed her tomb. She died in Florence. They were both artists. She was his student. They had gone out sketching in the rain. She caught a terrible cold and passed away. And so he sculpted her effigy and placed it. She's buried in the Allori Cemetery in Florence. So if you ever go to Florence and go to the Allori Cemetery, you'll see the original. But her father-in-law was so moved by this effigy and its beauty that he commissioned at least 3 different casts. And I think one is in Stanford, this one is at the Met, and there's another one, I think, in Boston. Pierre did something entirely different. He didn't chronicle Louise as she declined. He did not memorialize her with a grave marker. But what he did do was something unique, and I've not seen an example going all the way back, and I've now studied probably over 1,500 artists that fit into my category, starting with Jan van Eyck, and as was mentioned later, Lucian Freud, who, by the way, did do a deathbed portrait of his mother. And Pierre basically portrayed himself as he was then, getting older himself. He's got his cane, but he's literally in this work warming himself with the memories of Martha and Louise as they once were. So here's this older man finding comfort in the memories and recreating those memories by having them close around him. And one of the things, I wish I'd said it in the catalog, so I was walking around the show with Richard today, I thought, oh my gosh, I didn't realize, artists, you can't get it all in one swoop, but notice the language of the hands. And this accent on these blessing gestures and prayerful gestures is very much the language of sacred imagery. And this reinforces the kind of solemn and sacred dimension that he felt in connection to his own family. And this was how he coped with what he was dealing with. And it's a series of 3 paintings. They're all in the show. Here, he's with Louise and Martha. Well, I guess I only show the one. In the next one, Louise is slipping away. And in the final one, you should see these in the show, he's by himself. Louise has literally slipped away, and he's confronting himself in old age. So he really contemplated the future in this series, but he also really found the warmth and the joy in what he and Louise and Martha had together as a family. And look at the colors. The colors are warm, they're glowing, they're luminous. The gestures are full of grace. So this is not anything pessimistic. And this is the kind of positive message that an artist can hand down to the next generation. We're all going to face these kinds of losses, but only a few artists have the insights to create an icon of endurance, is what I would call it, an icon of grace, it would be another way that I would call it. And this is really a very, very special legacy. And this is also comes from this period. It's a final tribute to the mother and child, to Louise and Martha, both solid and transparent, dressed and undressed, surrounded by doves, embracing each other tenderly. One last beautiful tribute to everything he felt was important in his life. So again, Pierre doesn't end on a depressed note or a pessimistic note, but with a note of joy and blessing and happiness and love. So, as you can see just from this very brief survey, that Pierre Daura has a very special place in the history of art. He really found ways to express the positive, the spiritual, the incandescent beauty of the love he had experienced and shared with Louise and Martha. And what makes him such a remarkable artist is that he found new forms in which to do so, and at the end of his life took creative comfort in the memories of the warmth of the attachments he shared with his family. In so doing, Daura truly stretched our experience and understanding of the universal meaning of love and has really, truly left us an enduring legacy. And I can also say, because my research has continued since working on Pierre, which has been an enormous privilege, that I still have not found another artist who has done what Pierre has done. So this is really a remarkable legacy that he's left us, and I can't thank you enough, Martha, for everything you did to help me realize this amazing project. Thank you so much.